Let's take a quick look at the road to the Constitution historical aspect before 1789. In 1215, in England, Magna Carta was signed forcing King John to accept some limits on his power. Rule of law, that nobles and property owners had rights, and very important that English citizens had the right to trial by jury. In 1628, the Petition of Right again further eroded the power of the king. There could be no arbitrary imprisonment without formal charges, what today we call habeas corpus. That no quartering of troops could occur in citizens' homes without their permission. And probably most important, now that there was a parliament to further limit the power of the king, that no taxation could happen without the consent of parliament. Later on, Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, looking at that life under anarchy is nasty, brutish, and short. And because anarchy cannot exist and the government has to come about, the best form of government, as far as Hobbes was concerned, is that there was a social contract among the people to accept strong rule, in his case, in the case of the time, a strong monarch, to protect property. And rights would be protected by force, and the people would accept that under a social contract. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights was written, again further eroding the power of the monarch. The end of so-called divine right, a God-given right to rule, that the monarch had to submit to the power of the parliament in making policy, and further that rights were limiting the power of the government. After 1689, the traditional absolute monarch ends in England, and you have a situation like you have today where the king and the queen rule, but only under the acceptance of parliament. In 1690, John Locke, taking some ideas from Thomas Hobbes, wrote his second treatise on government, and looking at that there were natural rights that people had of life, liberty, and property that were given to people by God, and that no government could take away. And if a government tried to take away those rights, the people had a right to revolt. Now going over to the American colonies. In 1765, as you all know in your history, the colonists began to rebel against English rule, crying taxation without representation, that they were not represented in the English Parliament, and therefore Parliament had no right to tell the American colonies what to do. First Continental Congress in 1774 resulted in the intolerable acts by England, taking away colonial rights. The colonists fought back with a boycott of English goods. The Continental Association was formed under Sam Adams as leader and trying to stir up rebellion in the colonies. The English government refused to acquiesce. As a result, you had the Second Continental Congress in 1775, where they formed the Continental Army, asked George Washington to head that army. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet known as Common Sense, showing that it was just common sense for the American colonies to rebel against England. And the Second Continental Congress wrote a document asking a committee headed by Thomas Jefferson to write a Declaration of Independence. In the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, shown here in this painting, the colonists at the time, looking that the last straw had been handed down, looked at rebelling against England. Most important thing to come out of the Second Continental Congress and the basis of all American government is that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which John Locke would have termed the pursuit of property. Most important, though, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The people control the government. That when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. John Locke's point about righteous revolution. Instituting new government, laying its foundations and principles in such form it's to them most likely to affect their safety and happiness. In other words, government of the people, by the people, for the people. So says Lincoln later on. Today, this is Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress and eventually the Constitutional Convention will take place. We'll look at further what happens with the Constitution after the Revolution in the next series.